Hi, Bill.
Hi, Jane. How are you?
Good. Very good to
Good.
see you.
Good
Wow,
to see you.
this is amazing and incredible time for uh, the conversation we're going to have for today. So anyway, this is the theme we're going to have is and topic would it be reflection of U.S.-China relations and mission and election 2020. You and I have been doing China mission for 20 years. We appreciate it so much, but this is such a incredible time, especially a real, in a real sense, to share biblical worldview, how Christians will look at the society and cultural transformation. So I have 10 questions.
Okay.
I just came up with what I think is important, but maybe some other time we can face to face through Zoom with some of the Christians, Chinese Christians online to ask you directly. But this is,
Sure.
so first question is you told me many years ago that America is in very deep trouble. It's like a Titanic ship heading inevitably to a fatal crash and sinking. And I don't remember who said that. I just
Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer.
oh, Schaefer.
Yes.
Okay, Francis Schaeffer. So uh, today, do you still think that way, or since you have been involved heavily in the biblical worldview movement, quote unquote movement, for many years. If I remember, probably 10 years. Do you think U.S. is changing because Christian is making a difference? So I just let you to reflect on that.
Sure. Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to be on the YouTube program. I appreciate that, and secondly, let me congratulate you on your U.S. citizenship. I wish I was there for the ceremony. That would have been a wonderful experience, but because of COVID and other things,
Just
we
one person, one
what
person.
one person. Well, you and Jesus, and who else?
The immigration officer.
Immigration officer. So, but I'm happy for you. I'm
Thank you.
happy for you, and back to the question, which is very keen, very keen, and when we talk about biblical worldview, we're talking about those ideas that come from the scripture about the reality of the universe in which we live. Okay, and there are two very different worldviews that are vying for competition for the minds and the where we think and the hearts where we decide about what kind of people we're going to be.
Mhm.
And the first worldview is the worldview that came to America, to North America, from Europe, and that is the worldview that ultimate reality, that which is self-existent, is an eternal, personal, loving creator. Okay, and that is number one feature of the biblical worldview. It's not feeding the poor. It's not preaching the gospel. It's none of those. The key central thing about the biblical worldview is that there is a God who does not need anything for he himself to exist, does not need the universe. Okay. And so ultimate reality is spiritual, that ultimate reality is spiritual. The number one competing worldview with that played itself out in Europe, that brought us World War I and World War II, It brought us communism in the Soviet Union and China, Cuba, and other places. That second worldview says that ultimate reality is not spiritual, but the only thing that really exists that is ultimate and eternal is matter, time, space, chance, and everything that we see is a cosmic accident. Okay, and that there was no intelligent design. That ultimate reality is not spiritual, and those two worldviews are in conflict with each other. The starting point with the one says that God ultimately exists, does not need the universe. The second worldview says God does not exist, and only the universe, only the material universe exists, and that people who are fully persuaded, I don't want to use the word belief, because in the 19th and 20th century, there were philosophers and there were theologians that abused the word faith, and they abused the word belief. They stripped it from any kind of rationality, which is not the biblical meaning of the word. That's not the classical meaning of the word. We began to see terms like a leap of faith or irrational faith, or, that against all reason faith. No. That is not the biblical worldview of faith. The biblical worldview of faith is to be fully persuaded, absolutely fully persuaded. And so there are people who, in their view, that they are fully persuaded that God does not exist. That is their faith. That is their faith. And the faith that is opposed to that is the faith that says God exists, and that is their faith. They're both sides of this question are fully persuaded that they are accurate about their read of reality. And it's not just what I feel in my heart, it's what is out there in the universe, what is true about the universe. Well, if you start with the idea that there is a loving God, just God, holy God, He's eternal, He makes the human being in His image and likeness, that we can come to the conclusion that the human being has value, that we're made in His image and likeness. And because we're made in His image and likeness, that we can have something like the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to pursue happiness, because the human being has value and dignity that is not assigned to that by any other human being, and especially a governing entity, a government entity. That other worldview, the naturalistic worldview, says that the human being is a cosmic accident, and that the human being does not have the right to life, the human being does not have the right to liberty, and the human being does not have the right to pursue happiness. One worldview comes from God, the other worldview comes from Satan, and we're seeing the principalities and powers playing out on the world stage, and that America, that if it maintains its Christian heritage, it will continually embrace the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But if America shifts over to have the primary persuasion in America is that God does not exist, then America is not in for life, it's in for death. It's not in for liberty, it's in for bondage.
You at the same time answered my question in number 9, which is biblical worldview. But what is let me to help our audience to understand why the American problems, what's the root cause for today so many problems in America?
Yes. Yes.
How are you going to relate that?
Absolutely. It doesn't matter whether it's education, politics, Black Lives Matter, economics. It doesn't matter. That these two worldviews, starting point, God does not exist. The other starting point is God does exist. That those two worldviews are are in conflict. They cannot, they are absolutely always in conflict because both of them cannot be true. And so America right now, the battle, for instance, is not between Trump and Biden. The battle is between one man that says that God is in charge of the universe, and the other man that, even though he has religious trappings in his life, he's really fully persuaded that God has no business and God truly doesn't
yeah,
exist.
so I'm glad we have this conversation. So because I heard you talking about the 20 years, I understand. But for many Chinese Christians, whether they're in China, they're interested or really praying for America, or those people already in America, they don't see that in the news.
That's correct.
They don't see that even in the church, people talking about the Trump and the Biden and all this, but they don't hear and see what you talking about is behind everything else.
That's correct.
Is because of this conflict of the worldview.
So what I want to affirm, Jane, is exactly the point that you're leading to here, and that is both presidential candidates in the United States are fallen sinners in need of the grace of God and forgiveness by God. Okay.
Yes.
However, so they share that. They share that both of them are fallen sinners in need of God's grace, and every Christian listening to this needs to understand that I am fully persuaded that Donald Trump is a sinner, and I'm fully persuaded that Joe Biden is a sinner, and I'm fully persuaded that Bill Redmond is a sinner, and that Jian Zhu, that you're a sinner, that we are all sinners in need of God's grace. However, God did establish government to establish justice and to punish the evil and the wicked. He established government for a purpose. And in our case, where we select the leaders in the United States, that when we select those leaders in this election, more so than any other election, that we have the choice to vote for a sinner who has rejected the lordship of Jesus, or vote for a sinner that is in his humble way embracing that Jesus is Lord of not only the universe, but the whole creation, and that justice in America can only be grounded in God's revelation. This president has done more for the poor and the unborn and for the handicapped people and minorities than any president in the history of the United States.
Yeah. So following your thoughts, and because I watched you and myself participating also the biblical worldview, the Christian worldview that across America for the last 10 years. From my perspective, I see the movement of biblical worldview do make a difference. Do you see that?
Absolutely. That everybody is going to act on what they ultimately believe is true about reality. Mm-hmm. And so there are people that say, well, I'm a Christian, or I'm a Baptist, or I'm a Catholic, or whatever. Okay. But when Jesus said you'll know them not by their words, but by their deeds. And that a person, every human being at the end of the day is going to act in such a way consistent with what they truly believe, not the label that they're wearing. So not the label that they're wearing.
Do you see those kind of fruits or awakening coming?
That's correct. That's correct. And let me give personal testimony here. Personal testimony, okay? That I, at one particular time, and I shared this with you, is that I grew up in a very liberal area of Chicago, grew up with very liberal Democrat ideas. Some of the ideas were socialist.
You were Catholic. You were Catholic.
Yes, that's correct. But even though that was the label on the outside, the thinking in my head was I was a product of the 20th century. And I was a product of the naturalistic worldview that basically said, well, it's religion in my heart, but pragmatism and materialism inside my head. And so I was able to say, well, in my heart, I think there's a God. Maybe there's a God. I hope there's a God. But human life really doesn't have any value. And I supported the abortion of unborn children. I supported killing handicapped people. I supported killing senior citizens that could no longer monetarily contribute to society because of what value are they? See, that's looking at the world from the true worldview that was in my head. It was a pragmatic, naturalistic, materialistic, material dialectic, as some of the communists would say. And even though I called myself Catholic and I went to church and did the things, in my head, I was a naturalist. It wasn't until I became a Christian and said, Jesus is Lord, and then grew and began to understand to what extent had I compromised my thinking. I was laying my heart at the foot of the cross, but I was taking my thinking in a completely different direction. But God made us an integrated whole, and our thinking and our heart has to come together. And so there are too many people, both in Catholic and Protestant, evangelical, non-denominational, that they're confessing the story of Jesus with their mouth, but when it really comes to their thinking, as in the case with Mr. Biden, is that he's not a Christian. That there are Catholic priests right now that have come out and they have identified him as not only not a Catholic, but being anti-Catholic and being anti-Christian, not because of what he says with his lips, but by the actions of 40 plus years of denigrating the image and likeness of God in the human being, the baby, the child, the adult, also denigrating the sanctity of marriage, where the male and female come together to create another human being that in that unique relationship is a unique reflection of the image and likeness of God. Mr. Biden has rejected the image of God in the human being, and now there are Catholic leaders that are coming out and saying he is not a Catholic, he is not a Christian. And in fact, one cardinal in the Catholic Church said it is better to vote for a good Protestant than a bad Catholic. So again, but this is not about denominational leader. This is not about church history. This is not about worship style. This is about what are we truly persuaded about God and the universe, and that's why we call it worldview. How do I view this world? What is ultimately real? Is material ultimately real, or is God ultimately real?
Sure. Thank you. So we have pretty much covered the question.
So that's the root. It's not Democrat versus Republican.
Sure.
In fact, I'll just tell you right now, and you've heard me say this before, people who are inside the Republican Party that have a naturalistic worldview in their head, eventually they will find themselves inside the Democrat Party. Mm-hmm. That the Republican Party goes back to the founding of America, and it says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator, not the government. So at this particular point in the history of America, the leadership and the vast majority of people who belong to the Republican Party hold the truths of the scripture to be the truth of reality and the truth of what America is supposed to be. So the problem is not Democrat, Republican. The problem is worldview. The problem is worldview.
You touched the topic, and I want to ask you about the Declaration of Independence. Could you tell our audience your experience in our Chinese church?
Yes.
When one time you shared, the Declaration of Independence, and when you find out the translation is different.
Yes.
And that also made me to be aware, huge difference. Could you tell that experience?
Sure. Well, I want to start that story by a quote that I believe it comes from C.S. Lewis, and I think it was Lewis that said that the corruption of language is the beginning of the fall of a civilization.
Wow. Really?
The corruption of language is the
Wow.
beginning of the fall of a civilization.
Wow.
And so when we corrupt
That's
language,
powerful.
yeah, that is powerful. That is, I wished I made it up, but I think it was C.S. Lewis. Okay. So here's the deal, is that not only has faith been redefined, belief redefined, that the words that they get intentionally mistranslated to completely create a different view in the mind of the hearer. And I had presented a message at your church once, and I talked about the Declaration of Independence, that it is the statement that created America is the Declaration of Independence. It's not the Constitution. I love the Constitution, but the main document in America is not the Constitution. It's the Declaration of Independence, and it's that statement that says that we hold, which means we're persuaded, we believe, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And to pursue these rights, governments are instituted among men. So that was the context of my statement, that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator. Well, when the service was over, one of the men from your congregation met me afterwards, and he said, "That's very interesting, because when I read it in Chinese, that's not what it said." And the Chinese version, the Chinese translation that this man had written or had read, it said, all men are born equal.
Mm-hmm.
That makes it completely, because if we're born equal, the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is no longer grounded in God outside of the universe, where no human can molest that right, that now the right is moved from being grounded in God to being grounded in a human entity, and in that case, the Communist Party of China.
Right. So that's a whole totally different. You mentioned it just now. First time I heard you saying that you seem to say Declaration of Independence is even more important than Constitution.
Absolutely.
Why is that? The first time I heard you saying that. Well, why is that?
Right. So the Declaration of Independence is the philosophical statement about reality.
Okay.
Because this is real, we are now going to build a government upon these principles. Mm-hmm. If you don't have the principles, it doesn't matter what you build, it's going to collapse. And so, for instance, let me compare two different ideas. In the Constitution, it says that a person can be elected to the presidency for 4 years. That is a clear and distinct idea inside the Constitution. Mm-hmm. The Declaration, it says all men are created equal. That's a completely different idea. When you weigh those two different ideas, that between the two of them, the more important is not that the president serve for 4 years. If he serves for 6 years, 10 years, 2 years, 10 minutes, that's flexible. But the idea that the human being is made in the image and likeness of God, and is created in the image and likeness of God, and God gave that human being the right to life. If you remove that or change that, the whole thing collapses.
The whole Constitution will.
The whole,
Groundless.
yes. The many modern states have constitutions, including China. The question is, what foundation does the Constitution rest?
Okay.
What is the worldview? If you look at it this way, that you have the worldview, and then on top of the worldview is built the governmental framework that actually supports the worldview, to propagate, to advance the worldview. Well, if you start with the wrong worldview, it doesn't matter what you
Constitution.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't matter. So, but I am a strict constitutionalist, and the preamble to the Constitution, something that you've heard me talk about before, but not as much as the Declaration. It says, "We the people." Okay, Abraham Lincoln said, "We are a government of the people, by the people, for the people." It's not that we are the servants of the government, for the government, by the government. That the governing entity under a biblical worldview, next to the sovereignty of God in our lives, is the people. And it's not the government. It's not, because the government is not the highest authority in the life of the human being. The government didn't make the human being. God made the human being. And because the human being is made by God, our highest authority is not the government. Our highest authority is God himself. And so the preamble says this: "We the people of the United States, in order to," and that's a purpose clause, "in order to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So the purpose of the Constitution was to make a reality in our society those truths that were inside the Declaration of Independence.
Okay, let's move on to the topic for corruption.